Thank you very much. I appreciate this invitation to be here and the opportunity to speak to what is obviously a very diverse and very interesting audience. I am a bit of a polymath. I've been interested in a lot of different subjects over the years, and I'm trained as a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, but in my earlier experience I was a philosopher. So I have a wide range. And some years ago I decided to try to trace the evolution of human beings from Miocene apes 5 million years ago, our common ancestor with modern chimpanzees. And so I'm going to just try to tell you as quickly as I can and in a fairly straightforward way the story of how the human mind, especially the modern mind, came into being. It's a complex story, but I think the bare bones can be exposed rather straightforward manner rather quickly. My basic message is that what makes humans so different from other species, from all the other species in the biosphere, including our very close relatives, the great apes, is that we build distributed cognitive networks. Now, any of you who do computing know what that is. A distributed network is one made up of many computers where they pool their resources. They don't try to solve all problems one at a time. Most animals are what you might call isolated minds. And unfortunately, a lot of early psychology and neuroscience was built on the isolated mind model, the idea that something comes into your head, you think about it, you solve it, and then you act. In fact, what we do is we solve things collectively, and in distributed networks, I'll gradually unfold that idea as I speak. The human brain, I've argued, for at least 2 million years has co-evolved with the emergence of these distributed networks. And it can't realize its design potential. That is to say, we wouldn't even be speaking, for example, until it is immersed in such a network. These networks themselves generate complex cognitive structures which we're connected to and which reformat our brains. And therefore, the brain's task is very complex. We have to assimilate the structures of culture and manage them. I'm going to argue that a lot of our most complex thinking strategies are actually culturally imposed and invented. The starting point for the human journey were Miocene primates about 5 million years ago, and I just want to make a brief comment about them, and that is that these are very smart animals, very closely related to us, anatomically as well as neuroanatomically, and even behaviorally. If you don't think you're a primate, take a good look in the mirror sometime and then take a look at the similarities between the human skeleton and that of any of the great apes. We're a transformation on that skeleton. And our nervous systems, if we go into the brain, is similarly, very, very similar to that of the great ape, except that it's extremely large. One of the things that they're very good at is social representation. They understand the structure of their societies. As an example of this, the alpha male in a group of primates is actually the one with the biggest number of allies. So it's not easy to identify him. In order to find out who the alpha male is, the other members of the group have to understand the relationships that that male has with other individuals, and that has ramifications all through the group. So they spend a lot of their time sitting around watching one another. Now, if you look at this image, borrowed from, with permission from Vance Duval, you'll notice that that female has in her mind an image of the group, and it's independent of where she's looking at the moment. She's monitoring everything that's going on in that group at the time. And within that imagined space, which we all are so good at as primates, she can move in and single out perhaps one individual, a rival, another female, and think about her while continuing to manage to monitor the rest of the group. Well, they construct out of this event representations. They can understand, for example, the events that lead to a change of power, the decline of an alpha male and a replacement by another, or other types of things such as bonding relationships between individuals in a group. The only thing they can do is they can't express that knowledge to anyone else. Whereas a human child watching, let's say, a dog fight can represent that dogfight in action, for example, by taking two models of dogs and having them fight. Even if they can't speak, children can do this. Or they might get down on their hands and knees and act out the fight. Right? But no other creature can do this. This is uniquely human. No one else can, as it were, act out an event representation. We call this event reenactment. So we can say that it's not just that they don't have speech and language, they don't have the ability somehow to get the knowledge that they have in these very powerful brains that they have out the 12 nerves, the 12 cranial nerves and the 7 descending cords of the spinal cord, which is the only way out of the nervous system in action. So you have to be able to get that knowledge and reformat it. All right, so how did we do this? We can do this. The first cognitive leap, I think, occurred over 2 million years ago when we know with great certainty that humans became skilled. There was a revolution in the cognitive control of movement. Humans rehearse skill. Animals don't. So, for example, many different types of primates throw things at one another when they have fights. But you'll never see a primate standing in the forest all day throwing stones, getting better at it the way human children do effortlessly and routinely. We are sculptors with our bodies. We can practice and modify skill. It's one of our great characteristics. And that, of course, if you know anything about brain anatomy, the truth is that humans have something like 10 times larger connection between the frontal lobes and the cerebellum than apes, and a much, much larger cerebellum. And these are structures that are important to skill. Now, one of my first insights was that I realized that with skill, you get expressive, culture-free, nonverbal expression. Basically, it's the same neurological system that produces pantomime, gesture, and imitation. Thus produces knowledge networks in culture that are specific to particular cultures that sustain these skill networks, for example, tool-making industries 2 million years ago. And this has led me to propose what I call mimetic social cognitive governance, of a period in archaic human prehistory of almost 2 million years when human beings were essentially governed by embodied mechanisms of social control. The group learns, and the group copies and transmits that knowledge in body memories, and that controls the governance of emotion. I'm going to give you some images that will perhaps hammer this home. Mimetic governments endures in human beings in ritual, custom, and convention. Now, this is a mural that was on the wall of the Peabody Museum at Yale. I was there for 4.5 years, where an imaginative artist has drawn what he thinks is the way that Homo erectus dealt with fire. Point is, it's a mimetic culture. There's a more recent, and there is a very recent picture of mimetic governance. All right. There again, unfortunately, there is a tendency in us, very, very deep, to conform and to need and be nurtured by ritual, custom, and convention, and all of this is highly mimetic and very unique to humans. I seem to be having some difficulty getting this thing to work. Okay. So just to review then, mimetic social cognitive governance dominated human prehistory for a long period and involves embodied social control. And there's a great deal I could say about this, but I better move on to the next phase, because modern humans are much more than this. We retained this aspect of our knowledge, but in the second leap, somewhere between 500,000 and 70,000 years ago, there's strong reason to believe that speech and language emerged, including the apparatus of speech, which involves some major anatomical changes to the vocal tract and to the neurology of the vocal system, respiratory control, and the lexical explosion speaks to the fact that we have thousands of words as opposed to simply dozens of signals that apes have. So we have tens of thousands of words, actually. The final thing is that the language defines itself as a powerful means of representation on the level of storytelling or narrative. And that is the basis of what we call mythos, or mythic culture. Language is, as you'll notice, one of the things it does is it reenacts events. So here's a storyteller putting together these nodes into a story that reenacts an event which elicits in the imagination of the listener an experience that that listener never really had themselves. The other revolutionary thing is that you can rearrange the events. You can create false events and so on. This is an extremely powerful tool. So the second distributed network in culture then is, the second domain is mythic culture. And this involves narrative networks, what we call the oral tradition. In order to evolve this, semantic and procedural memory, two memory systems of the human brain, had to vastly expand. We also had to develop what's sometimes called mind-sharing capability, the ability to share knowledge and track it at high rates as it changes. Gossip being an example. We track the relationships between people for hundreds and hundreds of individuals that we know. And finally, there is great selection here in Darwinian terms for executive and metacognitive skills, skills often identified with the frontal lobes of the brain. The adaptations underlying language, I won't dwell on this too long, but it does involve major challenges to the cognitive system. One of the most interesting ones is multifocal attention, and another, it involves a number of relevant brain adaptations. I won't have time tonight to dwell on this, but there is a lot of confirmatory evidence suggesting this from neuroscience. Social cognitive top governance then shifted in what we think of as classic human civilization is dominated by mythic culture. And I think the last 100,000 years we have very strong reasons to think that language and speech narratives dominate, but the mimetic elements remain. So ritual remains, all of the body embodied types of social controls remain in place, but subordinate to beliefs. This image that I'm showing you is the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, by the way. What's interesting about it is that every order of society is represented symbolically. It's a play act. It's a pantomime in a way. And that includes the crowds outside and the police that are controlling the crowds and all the rest of it. There's a social hierarchy unfolded and spelled out to people in a very informative way. That's a way of regulating behavior on a mass scale. All right, now I want to put in a third element into this before I tie it all together, and that is that I think in the last 40,000 years, we've had a revolution that is just as important in terms of our minds as the previous two. The one in action, which is mimesis, the one in language, and now one that is caused by technology, specifically memory technology and symbolic technology. This created new media external to brains. I call this external memory, which imposed neural reorganization. So in order to read, for example, you have to undergo a tremendous amount of training. Education was not necessary. Formal education systems were not necessary until we had mathematics and reading to learn. There is a hypothesis called the cultural recycling hypothesis, which I strongly support. I'll just show you one example. This was a study by Stanislas Dehaene in the Collège de France in Paris, which showed that basically when somebody learns to read, certain cortical maps that are normally in a person who doesn't read, and that's the vast majority of human beings in human history, those maps would be used for something else. But in being trained to read, those maps are entrained for a different purpose. And this has been studied in both the acquisition of mathematical skill as well as in reading, but it would apply to, for example, musicians learning how to handle notation and so on. In other words, dealing with symbols requires reorganizing the brain in a fundamental way. It creates what are called cognitive architectures in the brain that are functional architectures from rewiring it. I won't dwell on this particular image, but it's derived from the study of dyslexia and dysgraphia in psychology. And everything that you see on the, I guess on your left-hand side, your right-hand side of that diagram is a hierarchy of structures that does not exist in the brain of someone who is illiterate, which is 90% of human history. We only invented writing about 5,000 years ago. In other words, in becoming literate, the brain is functionally reorganized in a fairly radical way. And so in imposing literacy on a large population, you are literally reformatting the brains of large numbers of people in an important way. Now, this leads to the possibility of what I call hybrid networks. Carl Ashley years ago formulated the word engram, which refers to a memory record in the brain. And there are at least 4 or 5 different types of memory records in the brain. I've suggested the word exogram to cover memory records that are stored outside the brain. So encyclopedias, archives, books, libraries, and so on, all of those things, not to mention the internet. This has caused something that you could call the extrographic revolution, which has involved the invention of by the human species of an external symbolic storage system. This system, which involves a variety of different types of media, including things such as Stonehenge, that's a computational device, has novel properties that are biologically very important. Such memories are reformatable. I'd love to reformat my brain, but I can't do it, you know. They're quasi-permanent. They outlive individuals, whereas our memories die with us. It has unlimited capacity, whereas individual memories of humans have very great limitations. There are new retrieval options. For example, you can't Google your brain. It would be interesting if you could, but you can't. But you can, in various ways, access technological memories, and it performs work, as we see in computers. And so the history of exograms is a very important part of human history, and it has complexified our stored knowledge, our collective networks, if you want, of knowledge, by essentially addressing all previous forms of knowledge in turn, as well as introducing new forms of knowledge, such as mathematics. And mathematics is really a history of notations. That's what it really is. This created institutional change over a long period of time, several thousand years, and a shift in network memory to non-neural media. Our brains are increasingly entrained to those networks. Most of us in modern society are employed by the external symbolic storage system. You know, we work for it for 50 years, put one brick in the edifice and expire if we're lucky. You know, that's essentially what happens. We're very much wired into the network. So all 3 domains coexist in modern society in hybrid distributed cognitive networks. So now you look at the stock exchange a little differently. And these individuals in this exchange are old-fashioned human beings. They cannot function without these embodied social controls that I talked about in mimetic culture. They cannot function, they cannot become individuals with identities without plugging into the oral tradition, into the whole mythic tradition that backs it up. But finally, the governance of the world is now shifting to what we might call hybrid distributed systems. I think this has major consequences for the way we think about ourselves. I'm sorry, that image just flew by. That's a visualization of the internet. That's quite famous and it's interesting. And all of these networks encompass all of the stages of our evolution simultaneously. We are becoming something that we have never been before. In other words, we're in a sense in an adventure of self-discovery. Now, if I can get this thing to change, there we go. The long-term outcome of all of this, of assimilating artificial memory into our networks or into our cultural networks, is what I call theoretic governance and theoretic culture. Now, theoretic culture runs by different rules than anything that has preceded it. It's dominated by analytic thinking, which are institutionalized analytic thinking, as we find in government, corporations, science, legal systems, and technology especially. It has had an important impact on the arts, where I think the arts are much stronger in the oral mythic tradition and in mimetic side of things, for example, in cinema and in dance. You might say that the emergence of theoretic governance has had a major impact on the cultural cognitive structure of human beings as a group. Now, this is a much reproduced diagram, and I'm not going to leave it up there very much, but basically, this results in a 4-level type of model of the way the mind works. It has implications for things like morality, because morality emerges from all of these different levels. We can say there is a kind of morality in many social animals that show some form of altruistic behavior, for example, not killing someone who submits and that sort of thing. The thing about humans that is so particular is that we can override our basic instincts. And so models of morality that are based on studies of animals have only limited application, because human beings basically can construct morality in a variety of ways and may or may not behave in ways that are consistent with, as it were, with their instincts. We can demonstrate this by just looking at many different cultures in history, and we can see almost anything that you can find in one culture can be found to be contradicted in another somewhere. I've suggested that there is a contrasting style between traditional mythic culture, the traditional oral traditions of mythic culture, and what we call the new emerging high-tech theoretic culture. This list is one that I've presented a number of times, and which always elicits the question, are these descriptive terms, for example, narrative versus analytic, authority-based versus evidence-based, slow and deep versus fast and shallow, inner versus outer focus, highly emotional versus less so, closed versus open-ended, and so on. Are these necessarily fixed, or could it be that we could have a traditional form of culture that was entirely compatible with modern theoretic culture, and vice versa? Is theoretic culture necessarily this way? I think this is an overriding concern that cuts across many different very practical fields of endeavor in the modern world, and that a systematic approach to it might help. I'm not fooling myself that you can perhaps modify legal systems, political systems, and so on in any simple way with these ideas, but it may help at least put them in perspective and help us understand that they're all linked to real, live, red-blooded human beings who have gone through an awfully rapid evolution in the last few hundred years, to the point where I sometimes am concerned about our ability to manage such a fast rate of change. But it is also true that we've been remarkably successful in holding the whole thing together, and I sincerely hope that for the sake of my children and grandchildren that we will continue to do so in the future. Thanks very much.